The carriage jolted hard over a broken stone, and Eleanor Whitmore gripped the seat with both hands, her heart pounding faster than the horses outside. Tonight she would become a duchess. Tonight she would also have to hide the truth she had carried for 6 long years. And if she failed, everything she had worked for would fall apart before it even began. She looked down at her gloved hands and forced them still. Her mother, Constance, sat across from her, adjusting the folds of her own shawl, unaware of the storm raging quietly inside her daughter. Eleanor's father, Edward, had arranged this marriage through careful negotiation and no small amount of desperation. Their family estate had been struggling for years, ever since the fire. The fire, even now, the word alone made her skin tighten. It had happened when she was 17, on a cold night, when a fallen candle caught the drapes in her childhood bedroom. She had escaped, but not without a price. The flames had reached her back and her left shoulder before her old nurse pulled her free. The scars had healed over the years, pale and uneven, stretching like old riverbeds across skin that had once been smooth. No one outside her immediate family, and her maid, Margaret, had ever seen them. And no one ever would, if Eleanor had anything to say about it. She smoothed her wedding gown, a beautiful ivory silk with delicate embroidery along the sleeves, chosen carefully to cover as much of her shoulders as possible without appearing strange. Margaret had spent the entire morning helping her dress, wrapping a thin binding cloth beneath the gown to keep the fabric from shifting, to keep any curious eye from catching a glimpse of what lay beneath. "You look beautiful, my dear," Constance said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "The Duke is a fortunate man." Eleanor tried to smile. "I hope he thinks so." "He will." "Any man would." Her mother's eyes softened. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Eleanor admitted, though it was far more than a little. She was not simply nervous about marrying a stranger, a man she had met only twice before today, both times in the company of chaperones and polite, careful conversation. She was nervous about the moment when the wedding would end, when the guests would leave, when she and her new husband would finally be alone. The Duke of Ashcombe was known throughout the county as a serious, disciplined man. Julian Ashcombe had inherited his title young, after his father's sudden passing, and he had spent the years since building a reputation for fairness and quiet strength. Some called him cold, others said he simply preferred silence to gossip. Eleanor had heard both descriptions, and neither had told her anything about what kind of husband he might be. She had heard one other thing, whispered among the servants when they thought she was not listening. The Duke himself carried some kind of old injury, something to do with his right hand, though no one seemed to know the full story. She had wondered about it during their brief meetings, noticing the way he sometimes kept his hand tucked slightly behind him, the way his glove never quite came off even indoors. Perhaps, she thought, everyone carries something they would rather keep hidden. The carriage slowed as they approached the chapel, a modest stone building on the edge of the Ashcombe estate, chosen for its privacy rather than grandeur. Eleanor peered through the window and saw the guests already gathering outside, a small crowd of finely dressed men and women, murmuring to one another, waiting for the bride to arrive. Her stomach twisted. "Remember," her mother said gently, "hold your head high. You come from a good family. You have nothing to be ashamed of." If only that were entirely true. The carriage door opened, and Edward Whitmore extended his hand to help his daughter step down. Eleanor took a breath, steadying herself, and placed her gloved fingers in his. "You look like your grandmother did on her wedding day," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he rarely showed. She would be proud. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Father." They walked together toward the chapel doors, and with each step, Eleanor felt the weight of the day settle more firmly onto her shoulders. She thought of Margaret's careful hands that morning, wrapping the thin cloth beneath her gown, whispering instructions. "Keep the room dim tonight, if you can," Margaret had said. "Candles are kinder than lamps, and if he asks to help with your gown, tell him you prefer to manage such things yourself. Many brides feel shy on their first night. He will not think it strange." Eleanor had nodded, memorizing every word, though her chest had felt tight with dread even then. Now, standing before the chapel doors, she pushed the thought away and focused on the moment ahead. The doors opened, and the small gathering of guests turned to watch her enter. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching the color of the flowers arranged along the aisle. White roses mixed with pale blue thistle, the colors of the Ashcombe family crest woven subtly into the ribbons. And there, at the end of the aisle, stood Julian. He was taller than she remembered, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression composed in a way that gave little away. He wore his formal coat, deep navy with silver buttons, and though his posture was perfectly correct, something in his eyes seemed to soften slightly as she approached. Eleanor kept her steps measured, her chin lifted, just as her mother had instructed. She did not let her nerves show on her face, though inside, her thoughts raced faster than she could control them. What would happen tonight? How long could she keep this secret? What would he think of her if he ever discovered the truth? She reached the end of the aisle, and her father placed her hand gently into Julian's. His grip was steady, warm, careful. She noticed, briefly, the slight roughness of his glove against her palm, and wondered again about the mystery of his hand. The ceremony began. The priest spoke words that Eleanor barely absorbed, her mind too occupied with the enormity of the moment. She caught fragments, promises of loyalty, of care, of partnership, through all circumstances. She repeated her vows when prompted, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt beneath her ribs. When it came time for Julian to speak his own vows, his voice was low and even, carrying easily through the quiet chapel. I promise to protect this household, and the woman who now stands beside me, with everything within my power, he said. I promise honesty, in all things, and I ask the same in return. The words settled oddly in Eleanor's chest. Honesty. She swallowed, and said nothing, only nodded when the priest asked if she accepted, though a small voice inside her whispered that she was already breaking a promise before it had even been made. The ceremony concluded, with the priest pronouncing them husband and wife, and a polite ripple of applause moved through the small gathering. Julian turned to her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met directly. There was no warmth exactly, not yet, but there was something quieter than indifference. Curiosity, perhaps. An acknowledgement that they were now bound together, two strangers stepping into an unknown future. You did well, he said quietly, for her ears alone. Thank you, she managed. So did you. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but Eleanor found herself thinking about it long after they had turned to greet the gathered guests. The reception that followed was a blur of introductions, polite conversation, and careful smiles. Eleanor met members of the Ashcombe household staff, distant relatives of Julian's, and several neighboring families who had come to witness the union of two respected names. She answered questions about her family, her upbringing, her interests, all while keeping one part of her mind constantly alert, aware of the fabric of her gown, the binding cloth beneath it, the careful angle she kept her shoulders at whenever anyone stood close. Lady Priscilla Vane approached her at one point, a striking woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper smile. The new Duchess of Ashcombe, Priscilla said, her tone pleasant enough on the surface, though something calculating lingered beneath it. How fortunate you are. Julian could have chosen from half the county, you know. I am aware, Eleanor replied evenly. I consider myself fortunate as well. Of course, Priscilla said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I do hope you will settle in well. The Ashcombe household has certain expectations. Eleanor held her gaze steady. I intend to meet them. Priscilla's smile flickered, and after a moment, she moved on to speak with another guest, leaving Eleanor with an uneasy feeling she could not quite name. By the time evening arrived, and the guests began to depart, Eleanor's nerves had worn thin from hours of careful composure. Julian escorted her personally to the carriage that would take them to the main estate house, and for the first time all day, they were finally alone. The ride was quiet at first. Eleanor stared out the window at the darkening countryside, the fields rolling past in shades of deep blue and gray. You handled today with grace, Julian said eventually, breaking the silence. I imagine it was not easy, meeting so many strangers at once. I managed, she said, offering a small smile. You did more than manage. He studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Lady Priscilla can be difficult. I noticed you did not let her unsettle you. So he had seen that exchange. Eleanor felt a flicker of surprise. I did not want to give her the satisfaction. Julian's mouth curved slightly. Good. She rarely deserves it. The carriage rolled on, and for a while, neither of them spoke, though the silence felt less strained than before. Eleanor found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, noting the way he held himself, upright, but not stiff, composed but not cold. He was, she thought, harder to read than she had expected, and somehow that made her more curious rather than less. When they finally arrived at the estate house, a grand structure of pale stone, with tall windows glowing warmly from within, Eleanor felt her chest tighten again. This was it. This was where the day would end, and where her carefully guarded secret would face its first true test. Julian helped her down from the carriage, his hand steady beneath hers, and together they walked up the wide stone steps toward the entrance. Servants greeted them with quiet bows and murmured congratulations, and a housekeeper named Beatrice stepped forward to guide Eleanor toward the private wing of the house that would now be hers. "I will see you shortly," Julian said, his voice low, meant only for her. Eleanor nodded, unable to find words, and followed Beatrice down a long corridor lined with portraits of Ashcombe ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every step. Her new chambers were beautiful, a spacious room with tall windows overlooking the gardens, a large bed draped in soft blue linens, and a fireplace already crackling gently despite the mild evening. Margaret was waiting for her there, having traveled ahead earlier in the day to prepare everything. "How are you feeling, my lady?" Margaret asked softly, closing the door behind them. "Nervous," Eleanor admitted, sinking onto the edge of a cushioned chair. "More nervous than I expected." Margaret knelt beside her, helping to unfasten the delicate buttons along the back of her gown. "We prepared for this. Remember what we discussed. Keep the light low. Keep your composure. You have hidden this before, and you can hide it tonight." "I know," Eleanor whispered, "but tonight feels different." Margaret paused, her hands stilling for a moment. "He seems a good man, my lady. From what the staff say, he is fair and patient, and does not raise his voice even when provoked. Perhaps he will understand, in time." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, though she did not fully believe it. "But not tonight. Tonight I simply need him not to see." Margaret nodded, understanding, and continued helping her prepare. She dimmed the lamps as instructed, leaving only a single candle burning near the window, its light soft and forgiving. She helped Eleanor into a modest nightgown, made of thick ivory fabric that covered her shoulders and back completely, and adjusted the binding cloth beneath it one final time. "There," Margaret said, stepping back to examine her work. "You look lovely, and nothing shows." Eleanor studied herself in the mirror, turning slightly to check the fabric across her shoulders. The scars were completely hidden, the gown falling just right to conceal every trace. She exhaled slowly, some of the tension in her chest easing, if only slightly. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." "Of course, my lady. I will be just outside if you need anything." Margaret curtsied and slipped quietly from the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the crackling fire and the single candle by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere down the corridor, she heard the faint murmur of voices, servants finishing their evening duties, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, louder than it had any right to be. A knock came at the door, soft but unmistakable. Eleanor's breath caught. "Come in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened, and Julian stepped inside, having changed from his formal wedding attire into a simpler dark robe over his shirt and trousers. He glanced around the room, taking in the dimmed lamps and the single candle, before his gaze settled on her. "I hope the room suits you," he said, closing the door behind him. "It is lovely," Eleanor replied, forcing a small smile. "Thank you." He crossed the room slowly, and Eleanor felt every muscle in her body tighten, though she tried to keep her expression calm, unreadable. Julian stopped a respectful distance away, studying her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "You seem tired," he observed gently. "It has been a long day." "It has," she agreed, grateful for the opening. "Very long." A pause stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable, but heavy, with unspoken questions. Julian glanced toward the low-burning lamps, then back at her. "If you would prefer more light," he began. "No," Eleanor said quickly, perhaps too quickly. She softened her tone. I find the candlelight peaceful, after such a busy day, if that is agreeable to you." Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps simply patience. "Of course, whatever brings you comfort." He moved to sit in a chair near the fireplace, rather than approaching the bed directly, and Eleanor felt a small wave of relief wash over her, though she tried not to let it show too plainly on her face. "May I ask you something?" Julian said after a moment. "Of course. What did you think, the first time we met? Be honest." Eleanor considered the question carefully. Their first meeting had been brief, arranged by their families, in a formal parlor with chaperones present, both of them polite and cautious with one another. "I thought you seemed careful, guarded, perhaps. I was not certain what to make of you. And now?" "I am still not entirely certain," she admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips despite her nerves. "But I think there may be more to you than what people say." Julian's mouth curved into something closer to a real smile this time. "People say a great many things. Some of it is even true." "And which parts are true?" she asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward the fire before returning to her. "I suppose you will find out, in time. Marriage tends to reveal such things, whether we intend it or not." The words settled uneasily in Eleanor's chest, though she kept her expression composed. "I suppose it does." They continued talking for a while longer, conversation drifting between safe, comfortable topics: the estate grounds, her family's history, small memories from childhood that felt safe to share. Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly despite everything, surprised by how easy it was to talk with him once the initial tension eased. Eventually, Julian rose from his chair, glancing toward the window where the candle had burned lower. "It grows late. You should rest. Tomorrow will bring its own demands." Eleanor nodded, relief, and something else, something she could not quite name, mingling in her chest. "Good night, Julian." "Good night, Eleanor." He paused at the door, glancing back at her, with an expression she could not fully read in the dim light. "I am glad we are beginning this way, gently. There is no need to rush anything between us." The door closed softly behind him, and Eleanor sat alone in the quiet room, her heart still racing, though for entirely different reasons now than before. She had survived the first night. Her secret remained hidden. But as she settled beneath the blankets and blew out the final candle, she could not shake the feeling that Julian Ashcombe was far more perceptive than he let on, and that hiding the truth from him might prove far more difficult than she had ever imagined. Somewhere in the darkness of the house, she thought she heard Margaret's soft footsteps pause outside her door, checking, waiting, before finally retreating down the corridor. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself a small measure of hope. Perhaps this marriage would not be the trap she had feared. Perhaps, in time, there might even be room for something like happiness. But hope, she knew, was a fragile thing, and secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, had a way of finding the light eventually. The morning sun rose gently over the Ashcombe estate, spilling gold across the gardens and touching the tall windows of Eleanor's new chambers. She woke slowly, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar room, before memory returned, and with it, the weight of everything that had changed in a single day. She was no longer simply Eleanor Whitmore. She was the Duchess of Ashcombe now, bound to a man she barely knew, carrying a secret that could unravel everything the moment it was discovered. Downstairs, in the quiet hours before the household fully woke, Julian stood by a window in his study, his gloved hand resting against the cool glass, his thoughts equally occupied. He had noticed things the night before, small things, the careful way Eleanor had angled herself, the insistence on dim candlelight, the flicker of relief when he had chosen not to press closer. He was not a man who ignored such details. Whatever she was hiding, he intended to be patient. But patience, he knew from his own experience, only lasted so long before the truth demanded to be seen. And Julian Ashcombe, more than most men, understood exactly what it meant to carry something hidden beneath careful composure. The days that followed the wedding settled into a careful rhythm, though Eleanor never quite let herself relax completely. She learned the layout of the estate house slowly, guided by Beatrice the housekeeper, who seemed to take quiet pride in showing the new Duchess every corridor, every sitting room, every hidden staircase, that connected the family's private quarters to the busier parts of the house. Julian, for his part, remained courteous and measured, never pushing for more closeness than she seemed willing to give. He ate breakfast with her each morning, discussed small matters of the household, and in the evenings, they often sat together in the drawing room, sometimes reading, sometimes talking about nothing in particular. It was not the passionate romance Eleanor had once imagined marriage might bring, but it was gentle and steady and far kinder than she had dared to hope for. Still, beneath the calm surface, her guard never fully lowered. Margaret continued to help her dress each morning and prepare for bed each night, always with the same quiet efficiency, always mindful of the binding cloth and the careful arrangement of fabric across her shoulders. Eleanor had grown so practiced at the routine that it had become almost second nature, though the constant vigilance still wore at her, a quiet exhaustion that never fully lifted. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into the marriage, Eleanor sat in the small library at the back of the house, a room she had come to favor for its quiet and its tall shelves of well-worn books. Sunlight streamed through the window, warm and golden, and she had lost herself in a novel when a soft knock interrupted her. "My lady," said a young maid named Grace, stepping into the room with a stack of folded linens. "The housekeeper asked me to bring these for the guest chambers. I did not realize you were here. I can return later, if you prefer quiet." "No need," Eleanor said, closing her book gently. "Please, continue your work." Grace nodded and moved toward the far side of the room, setting the linens onto a low table before turning to arrange them properly. As she reached for the topmost cloth, her sleeve caught against the edge of a small side table, knocking over a vase of water that had been placed there earlier that morning. The water spilled quickly across the floor and, before Eleanor could react, splashed lightly against the hem of her sleeve and shoulder. "Oh, forgive me, my lady," Grace said, flustered, immediately reaching for a cloth to clean the mess. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to startle you." "It is quite all right," Eleanor said quickly, though her heart had already begun to race. The water had only touched the outer fabric of her sleeve, nothing more, but the sudden motion and the dampness against her arm sent a jolt of alarm through her that felt entirely disproportionate to the small accident. "Let me fetch a fresh gown for you," Grace offered, still apologizing. "I can help you change right away. It will only take a moment." "That will not be necessary," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than she intended. She saw Grace flinch slightly at the tone, and immediately regretted it. "I simply meant that I can manage on my own. Please, do not trouble yourself further." Grace hesitated, clearly confused by the reaction to such a minor spill, but nodded and finished cleaning the floor in silence before excusing herself from the room. Eleanor sat alone afterward, her heart still pounding, frustrated with herself for reacting so strongly to something so small. It was not the wetness itself that had frightened her. It was the reminder of how easily an accident, however innocent, could lead to exposure. A torn sleeve, a slipped shawl, a moment of carelessness while dressing, any of these could reveal what she had spent years concealing. Later that evening, as Margaret helped her prepare for bed, Eleanor recounted the incident, still troubled by her own sharp reaction. "I frightened the poor girl," Eleanor said, sitting before the mirror as Margaret brushed out her hair. "She meant no harm, and I spoke to her as though she had committed some terrible offense." "She will recover," Margaret said gently. "Young maids spill things often enough. She will not think much of it by tomorrow. I hope you are right." Eleanor met her own eyes in the mirror, troubled. "But it reminded me how fragile all of this is, Margaret. One small accident, and everything could unravel." Margaret's hands paused briefly on the brush. "You have kept this hidden for 6 years, my lady. You know how to manage it. Do not let one spilled vase shake your confidence." "It is not the vase that troubles me," Eleanor admitted quietly. "It is the growing feeling that I cannot keep this hidden forever. Not here, in a house full of servants and staff, all watching, all curious about their new duchess." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, continuing her work in thoughtful silence. "Perhaps," she finally said, "there may come a day when it no longer needs to be hidden. The Duke seems a reasonable man." "Perhaps," Eleanor echoed, though she could not yet imagine such a day arriving. The thought of Julian seeing her scars, truly seeing them, filled her with a dread she could not fully explain even to herself. It was not simply vanity, though she would not deny some of that fear existed as well. It was deeper than that, tied to memories of pity and discomfort she had witnessed on other faces over the years, whenever the scars had been glimpsed by accident. She did not want pity from her husband. She wanted, if anything, to be seen as capable, as whole, not as a woman marked by tragedy. The following days brought no further incidents, though Eleanor remained more cautious than ever. Live, double-checking every gown, every binding cloth, every angle of light in every room she entered. Julian, meanwhile, seemed to grow slightly more curious about her, asking gentle questions over dinner about her interests, her opinions, the books she favored in the library. "You seem to prefer solitude," he observed one evening, as they sat together after a quiet meal. "The library, the gardens in the early morning, before the household wakes. Is this simply your nature? Or is there something you find peaceful in it?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I suppose both. I have always found comfort in quiet places, fewer eyes watching, fewer questions to answer." "Questions can be uncomfortable," Julian agreed, his tone thoughtful. "Though I find that avoiding them entirely rarely makes them disappear. They simply wait for a better moment to return." Eleanor glanced at him, wondering if his words carried more meaning than their surface suggested. "You speak as though from experience." "Perhaps I do." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "We all carry questions we would rather not answer, Eleanor. I do not ask you to share yours before you are ready. I only hope, in time, you might feel comfortable enough to do so." The words settled heavily in her chest, equal parts comforting and unsettling. Comforting, because they suggested patience, understanding, a willingness to wait. Unsettling, because they confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Julian noticed more than he let on. He was simply choosing, for now, not to press. "Thank you," she said quietly, unsure of what else to offer. "There is no need to thank me for patience," he replied. "It costs me nothing, and it may earn your trust in return. That seems a fair exchange." Later that week, Eleanor encountered Lady Priscilla again, this time during a social visit arranged between neighboring families. The gathering took place in the grand sitting room of the Ashcombe estate, filled with polite conversation, tea, and the quiet clinking of porcelain cups. Priscilla approached her with the same sharp, calculating smile Eleanor remembered from the wedding. "How are you settling into married life, Duchess?" Priscilla asked, emphasizing the title with a faint edge of mockery. "I imagine it must feel quite overwhelming, adjusting to such a grand household after your more modest upbringing." Eleanor kept her expression pleasant, refusing to rise to the bait. "The household has been welcoming. I have found my place here quite naturally." "How fortunate," Priscilla said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I do wonder, though, how well Julian truly knows you. Arranged marriages can be so full of surprises, don't you think? Sometimes husbands discover things about their wives they never expected." The comment felt pointed, deliberate, though Eleanor could not tell if Priscilla knew anything specific, or was simply probing for weakness out of jealousy and spite. She kept her composure carefully in place. "I suppose every marriage holds surprises," Eleanor replied evenly. "I imagine yours would as well, should you ever find a husband willing to overlook your manner of conversation." Priscilla's smile tightened, clearly caught off guard by the calm, sharp response. She said nothing further, excusing herself shortly after to speak with other guests, though Eleanor noticed her glancing back more than once throughout the remainder of the gathering, her expression thoughtful in a way that felt distinctly uncomfortable. That night, as Eleanor recounted the exchange to Margaret, her maid's expression grew concerned. "She may simply be jealous, my lady," Margaret said, folding away the evening gown carefully. "Many hope to marry the Duke themselves. Her words may carry no real weight behind them." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, though unease lingered in her chest. "But I did not like the way she looked at me, as though she were searching for something specific." "We will be careful," Margaret assured her, "as we always are." Eleanor nodded, though sleep did not come easily that night. But she lay awake for hours, staring at the shadows cast across the ceiling by the dying fire, her thoughts circling endlessly between Priscilla's pointed comments and Julian's quiet patience, two very different kinds of attention directed toward the same hidden truth. The following morning, she woke early, before the household had fully stirred, and made her way to the gardens for a walk, hoping the fresh air might ease the tension that had settled into her shoulders. The gardens were beautiful in the early light, dew still clinging to the roses, the air cool and quiet. She found Julian there as well, standing near a stone fountain at the garden's center, his expression distant, thoughtful, as though lost in memories she could not access. "I did not expect to find you here so early," she said, approaching slowly. He turned, and something in his expression shifted quickly back to composure. "I often walk here in the mornings. It helps clear my thoughts before the day's demands begin. May I join you?" "Of course." They walked together in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant song of birds waking in the trees. "You seemed troubled just now," Eleanor said eventually, curiosity overcoming her usual restraint. "Before I arrived." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fountain's gently rippling water. "I was thinking of my brother," he said finally. "He passed some years ago. Sea's Gardens were his favorite place, before he became ill." Eleanor's chest tightened with unexpected sympathy. "I am sorry. I did not know. It is not something I speak of often." He glanced at her, something vulnerable, flickering briefly across his features, before retreating behind his usual composure. "Grief has a way of settling quietly, rather than disappearing entirely." "I understand that more than you might realize," Eleanor said softly, the words slipping free before she could stop them. Julian's gaze sharpened slightly, curious. "Do you?" She hesitated, aware she had said more than she intended. "I have known loss as well. My family's home, some years ago. We lost a great deal. I am sorry to hear that." His tone was gentle, sincere. "If you ever wish to speak of it, I am willing to listen, without judgment." The offer settled warmly in her chest, though fear kept her from accepting it fully. "Thank you," she said simply. "Perhaps, one day." They continued their walk, the conversation drifting toward safer topics once more, though something had shifted subtly between them, a small thread of shared vulnerability, neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. As the weeks continued, Eleanor found herself growing steadily more comfortable in Julian's presence, even as her guard remained firmly in place regarding her scars. She began to look forward to their morning walks, their evening conversations, the quiet companionship that had grown between them despite the marriage's unconventional beginning. Yet even as trust slowly built, the fear never fully vanished. Every accident, every careless moment, every curious glance from a servant or guest reminded her how fragile her secret truly was, and how much she still had to lose should it ever come fully into the light. Late one evening, after Julian had retired to his study to review estate matters, Eleanor found herself standing before her bedroom mirror, studying her own reflection in the dim candlelight. She reached back carefully, fingers brushing against the raised, uneven texture of skin beneath her nightgown, a familiar reminder of the night that had changed everything. She wondered, not for the first time, what it might feel like to stop hiding, to let someone see her fully, without fear of pity or rejection. She wondered, specifically, what it might feel like if that someone were Julian. But the thought frightened her more than she cared to admit, and so, as she had done countless times before, she pushed it firmly aside, blew out the candle, and settled into the darkness, her secret still carefully concealed for one more day. A month into the marriage, an unexpected letter arrived at the estate, carried by a rider who had traveled through the night to deliver it. Beatrice brought it directly to Julian in his study, her expression carefully neutral, though something in the way she held the envelope suggested she recognized its importance. Julian read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening slightly as his eyes moved across the page. Eleanor, who had been sitting nearby, reviewing household accounts with him, noticed the shift immediately. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He folded the letter carefully, his expression schooling itself back into composure, though not quickly enough to hide the flicker of old pain that had crossed his features. "An old acquaintance has passed. Nothing that requires immediate action, only news that stirs memories. I had not expected to revisit so soon." Eleanor wanted to ask more, but she recognized the careful walls he had raised around the subject, walls not unlike her own. "I am sorry to hear it." "Thank you." He set the letter aside and attempted to return to the household accounts, though Eleanor noticed his attention remained elsewhere for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, over a quiet dinner, Eleanor found herself watching him more closely than usual, curiosity mingling with growing concern. He ate little, responded to her questions with shorter answers than usual, and once, when reaching for his glass, his sleeve shifted slightly, revealing a thin edge of scarred skin along his wrist, before he quickly adjusted the fabric back into place. Eleanor said nothing, though she filed the observation away carefully, another piece of the quiet mystery surrounding her husband. Later, when they retired to the drawing room for their usual evening conversation, Julian remained unusually quiet, staring into the fire with an expression she had not seen from him before, something raw and unguarded beneath his typical composure. "You do not have to speak of it," Eleanor said gently, settling into the chair across from him. "But if you wish to, I would listen, as you once offered to listen to me." He glanced at her, something shifting in his eyes, a decision being weighed carefully before he finally spoke. "The letter concerned a woman I once intended to marry, before any of this." Eleanor's chest tightened, though she kept her expression steady, encouraging him silently to continue. "Her name was Helena," Julian said, his voice quieter than usual. "We were engaged for nearly a year, when I was young, before I inherited the title. I loved her, in the way young men believe they understand love, fully and without doubt. What happened?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "There was an accident, a fire, in the stables near her family's estate. I went in to help free the horses, and to search for her brother, who had gone missing inside. I found him, but not before the flames caught my hand and wrist. Helena believed, for a long while afterward, that the scars changed something in me, that I had become different, somehow, harder, more distant. She ended the engagement herself, though I never fully understood why." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, the parallel to her own fears, settling over her like a physical weight. "She left you because of the scars." "She said it was not only the scars," Julian said carefully. "She said I had changed, become guarded, less willing to share what I felt. Perhaps she was right. I do not know any longer. What I do know is that the experience taught me something important, something I have carried with me ever since." "What is that?" He met her eyes directly, his expression open in a way she had not seen before. "That scars, whether visible or hidden, tend to change how we allow ourselves to be seen. We build walls, believing they protect us, when in truth, they often protect us from the wrong things entirely." Eleanor sat very still, the weight of his words settling deeply into her chest. She thought of her own scars, hidden so carefully beneath layers of fabric and careful angles of light, and wondered, not for the first time, whether her own walls had grown too thick to ever fully come down. "May I ask," she said carefully, "why you keep your hand gloved, even indoors?" Julian glanced down at his gloved hand, resting on the arm of the chair. "Habit, mostly, and perhaps some remaining discomfort, though the physical injury healed long ago. The scarring runs along my wrist and partway up my forearm. Nothing severe, though it drew enough attention in my younger years that I grew accustomed to keeping it covered. Does it trouble you still, the memory of it?" "Less than it once did." He studied her thoughtfully. "Though I confess, speaking of it now feels different than it has in the past. Easier, somehow." "I am glad," Eleanor said softly, "that you felt you could share it. As am I." He paused, something contemplative crossing his features. "May I ask you something in return, Eleanor?" Her heart quickened. "Of course. You mentioned, some weeks ago, that you had known loss connected to your family's home. Was that connected to the reason you prefer such careful modesty? The dim candlelight, the high collars on your gowns even during warm weather?" The question hung in the air between them, gentle but direct, and Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to deflect, to change the subject, to protect the secret she had guarded for so long. "I am not yet ready to speak fully of that," she said carefully, meeting his eyes despite the discomfort. "But I promise you, Julian, it is not because I do not trust you. It is simply difficult, for reasons that have taken root over many years." Something in his expression softened further, understanding rather than disappointment. "I will not press you," he said. "I understand difficulty better than most. Take whatever time you require." "Thank you," she whispered, gratitude and guilt mingling uncomfortably in her chest. Gratitude for his patience, Guilt for the secret she continued to withhold, even as he had opened himself so freely to her. The conversation drifted afterward toward gentler topics, though the exchange lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after they had retired for the evening. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, turning his words over in her mind. Scars, whether visible or hidden, tend to change how we allow ourselves to be seen. Was that true of her as well? Had her own scars, hidden so carefully from the world, changed something fundamental in how she moved through life, how she connected with others, how she allowed herself to be truly known? She thought of Helena, the woman who had once loved Julian, and then left him, unable to see past the visible marks on his skin, to the man who remained unchanged beneath them. She wondered whether Julian feared the same rejection might await him again, whether his own careful walls existed not simply from habit, but from a lingering fear that anyone who saw his scars too closely might eventually pull away. Perhaps, she realized slowly, they were more alike than she had first understood. Two people who had each learned, through painful experience, that visible marks of suffering could change how others perceived them, and who had each built quiet defenses against that possibility ever repeating itself. The following days brought a subtle shift in their relationship, a deeper ease that had not existed before. Julian seemed to speak more freely, sharing small memories of his brother, his childhood, his early years managing the estate after his father's sudden passing. Eleanor found herself listening intently, cherishing each piece of him he offered, even as she continued to withhold the fuller truth of her own past. One afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens, Julian paused near a bed of late-blooming roses, his expression thoughtful. "My brother planted these, before he became ill," he said quietly. "He loved gardens more than anything else. Said they proved that even after the harshest winter, beautiful things could still grow again." Eleanor studied the roses, their petals deep red against the green foliage. "He sounds as though he understood something important." He did. Julian's voice carried a quiet warmth. "I think of him often, especially here, among these flowers he cared for so carefully. Thank you for sharing him with me," Eleanor said gently. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Julian said, glancing at her with a small, genuine smile. "He always said the quiet ones carried the deepest strength. I believe he would have been right about you as well." Warmth spread through Eleanor's chest at his words, a warmth she had not expected to feel so fully, so soon, within a marriage that had begun as little more than a practical arrangement between families. She found herself, increasingly, looking forward to each conversation, each quiet moment shared between them, each small revelation that drew them closer together. Yet even as the bond between them deepened, her secret remained. A quiet shadow lingering beneath every conversation, every embrace withheld, every careful adjustment of fabric across her shoulders each morning and night. She wondered how much longer she could maintain the careful balance she had constructed, how much longer trust could grow meaningfully between them, while such a significant truth remained hidden. Julian had shared his own scars, both visible and otherwise, with a vulnerability that clearly cost him greatly. She owed him, she began to realize, something similar in return. But not yet. The fear remained too strong, too deeply rooted in years of careful concealment, to release all at once. She told herself she needed more time, more certainty, that his patience and understanding would extend as fully to her own hidden truth as it clearly had to his memories of Helena and his brother. That night, as Margaret helped her prepare for bed, Eleanor found herself unusually quiet, lost in thought. "You seem troubled, my lady," Margaret observed, brushing out her hair with familiar, careful strokes. "I am simply thinking," Eleanor said softly, "about trust, and how difficult it becomes to maintain balance between protecting oneself and allowing oneself to be truly known." Margaret's hands paused briefly. "Has something happened with the Duke?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. "Nothing troubling. If anything, quite the opposite. He has shared things with me tonight that I believe cost him a great deal to speak aloud, and I find myself wondering whether I owe him the same courage in return." Margaret considered this carefully before responding. "Only you can decide when the time feels right, my lady. But do not let fear alone make that decision for you. Sometimes the things we fear most turn out gentler than we expect." Eleanor met her own reflection in the mirror, Julian's words echoing quietly in her mind. Scars, whether visible or hidden, tend to change how we allow ourselves to be seen. She wondered, increasingly, whether the greatest risk was not in revealing her scars at all, but in allowing fear to prevent her from ever truly being known by the man she was, slowly, cautiously, beginning to trust with far more than simple household matters. But that decision, she told herself once more, would have to wait for another day. Tonight, she simply blew out the candle, settled into the darkness, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine a future where hiding was no longer necessary at all. The Ashcombe estate had not hosted a grand gathering in nearly 2 years, not since Julian's brother had fallen ill, but with the marriage now settled and the household adjusting to its new duchess, Beatrice suggested that a formal evening might be a fitting way to properly introduce Eleanor to the wider circle of county society. Julian agreed readily enough, though Eleanor felt a flicker of unease at the prospect. A large gathering meant more eyes, more candlelight, more opportunities for the careful arrangement of her gowns to fail her at the worst possible moment. "You need not worry," Julian told her, noticing the tension in her shoulders as they discussed the guest list one evening. "You have handled every gathering since our wedding with grace. This will be no different." "I know," she said, though the reassurance did little to ease the tightness in her chest. "I simply prefer smaller company, easier to manage." "Understandable." He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. "If it becomes too much, you need only find me. I will not leave your side longer than necessary." The promise warmed her, though it did not entirely dissolve her nerves. Preparations for the evening consumed the household for nearly 2 weeks. Margaret worked tirelessly on Eleanor's gown, a deep emerald silk with long sleeves, and a high, elegant collar that would draw admiration for its design, rather than suspicion for its modesty. Beatrice coordinated with the kitchen staff on an elaborate menu, while Julian personally reviewed the guest list, ensuring the evening would reflect well on both the estate and its new mistress. The night of the gathering arrived with a golden autumn sunset spilling across the estate grounds. Carriages began arriving shortly after dusk, delivering members of county society dressed in their finest attire, eager for an evening of conversation, music, and the chance to properly meet the new Duchess of Ashcombe. Eleanor stood beside Julian, near the entrance of the grand hall, greeting guests as they arrived, her hand resting lightly in the crook of his arm. She had rehearsed polite responses to countless questions, prepared herself for every possible line of inquiry, and yet found herself, despite her careful preparation, genuinely enjoying the evening as it unfolded. The musicians began playing shortly after the last guests arrived, and couples moved gracefully across the polished floor of the grand hall. Julian led Eleanor into the first dance himself, his hand warm and steady against her waist, his movements confident despite his reputation for reserved formality. "You dance beautifully," he murmured, guiding her smoothly through the steps. "My mother insisted on lessons from a young age," Eleanor replied, allowing herself a genuine smile. She always said a woman should never appear uncertain on a dance floor, whatever uncertainty she might feel elsewhere. Wise advice. His eyes held hers steadily as they moved. "You appear anything but uncertain tonight." "Appearances can be deceiving," she said softly, though the words carried more truth than she intended to reveal. The evening continued pleasantly, filled with music, laughter, and the comfortable rhythm of polite society enjoying itself. Eleanor found herself relaxing gradually, the careful vigilance she maintained around her scars, settling into familiar background awareness, rather than the sharp, constant tension she had expected to feel. It was near midnight, as the gathering began thinning slightly, when Lady Priscilla approached, her expression carrying its familiar sharp edge, though tonight it seemed sharper still, fueled perhaps by wine or by something more calculated. "Quite the successful evening, Duchess," Priscilla said, her tone dripping with false warmth. "You have managed to charm quite a number of our neighbors, though I wonder how many truly know you yet, beneath such a carefully composed exterior." Eleanor kept her expression pleasant, refusing to let the comment unsettle her outwardly. "I suppose that is true of most people, Lady Priscilla. We reveal ourselves gradually, to those we trust." "Of course." Priscilla's smile tightened slightly. "Though I have heard whispers, you understand, among the staff. Curious little details about certain precautions taken in your household, dim candlelight in the bedchambers, high collars regardless of season, a peculiar insistence on privacy while dressing. Eleanor's chest tightened sharply, alarm flooding through her despite her outward composure. How much had Priscilla actually heard, and from whom? Servants' gossip, Eleanor said evenly, though her heart pounded rapidly beneath her calm exterior. I would not place much stock in idle chatter, Lady Priscilla. Perhaps not, Priscilla replied, though her eyes glittered with something calculating. Though gossip does tend to carry some truth within it, however small, I do hope, for your sake, that whatever you are hiding remains hidden as long as you wish it to. Before Eleanor could respond, Julian appeared beside her, having noticed the exchange from across the room. His expression remained composed, though something firm and protective settled into his posture as he addressed Priscilla directly. Lady Priscilla, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, I trust you are enjoying the evening. Quite thoroughly, Your Grace, Priscilla replied, her demeanor shifting immediately toward practiced pleasantness in his presence. I was simply complimenting the Duchess on tonight's success. Indeed, Julian's gaze held hers steadily, something unspoken passing between them that Eleanor could not fully interpret. I am glad to hear it, though I believe my wife has had quite enough conversation for one evening, if you will excuse us. He guided Eleanor away gently, his hand steady against the small of her back, leaving Priscilla standing alone, with an expression that flickered briefly between irritation and calculation, before smoothing back into practiced composure. Thank you, Eleanor whispered, once they were out of earshot, her heart still racing from the exchange. She has always enjoyed stirring discomfort where she can, Julian said quietly. Pay her little mind. Whatever she implies, it carries no real weight unless you allow it to. She mentioned things, Eleanor admitted, unable to fully hide her unease. Details about the household, things that should not concern outside gossip at all. Julian studied her carefully, concern flickering behind his composed exterior. What sort of details? Eleanor hesitated, torn between the instinct to deflect and a growing weariness with the constant vigilance her secret demanded. Nothing of true significance, she said finally, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Simply idle observations, twisted into something more mysterious than they truly are. Julian did not press further, though his expression remained thoughtful, clearly sensing there was more beneath her careful deflection than she was willing to share. If anything ever troubles you, Eleanor, I hope you know you can bring it to me directly, whatever it may be. I know, she said softly, gratitude and guilt once again mingling uncomfortably within her chest. Thank you, Julian. The remainder of the evening passed without further incident, though Priscilla's pointed words lingered uncomfortably in Eleanor's thoughts long after the last guests had departed and the household had settled into quiet stillness once more. Later that night, as Margaret helped her prepare for bed, Eleanor recounted the exchange in full, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. She knows something, Margaret, or at the very least, she suspects. Servants do gossip, Margaret said, though her expression carried genuine concern now as well. I will speak carefully with the staff tomorrow, remind them of the importance of discretion. It may already be too late for that, Eleanor said, sinking onto the edge of her bed, exhaustion settling heavily over her. If Priscilla has heard even fragments of the truth, she will not rest until she uncovers the rest. She made that much clear tonight. Margaret sat beside her, taking her hand gently. Then perhaps, my lady, the time has come to consider trusting the Duke with the full truth yourself, before someone else does it for you in a manner far less kind. Eleanor closed her eyes, the weight of the suggestion settling heavily over her chest. She thought of Julian's steady hand against her back as he guided her away from Priscilla, his quiet defense of her honor, the vulnerability he had shown her weeks earlier when speaking of his own scars and his lost engagement. Perhaps Margaret was right. Perhaps the risk of continuing to hide had grown greater than the risk of finally revealing the truth herself, on her own terms, before circumstance or malice forced the revelation instead. But even as the thought settled firmly into her mind, fear still coiled tightly in her chest, whispering all the reasons such honesty might still end in the very rejection she had spent 6 years working so carefully to avoid. She did not sleep well that night, her thoughts circling endlessly between Priscilla's threatening words and Julian's patient, steady presence, two forces pulling her toward a decision she was not yet certain she had the courage to make. Outside her window, the autumn wind stirred through the garden roses her husband's late brother had once planted, and somewhere in the darkness, she thought she heard the distant sound of a carriage departing the estate grounds, carrying Lady Priscilla back toward whatever plans she now intended to set into motion. 3 days after the gathering, the disaster arrived without warning, in the form of a runaway carriage horse and a stretch of muddy road just beyond the estate's front gate. Eleanor had gone into the nearby village that morning with Margaret, intending to purchase thread and fabric for a small mending project, a simple errand that had become routine over the past weeks. The return journey began uneventfully, the carriage rolling steadily along the familiar country road beneath an overcast sky. Then, without warning, a hare darted directly beneath the lead horse's hooves, startling the animal into a sudden, violent bolt. The carriage lurched sharply, the driver struggling desperately to regain control as the horses charged forward, panicked and uncontrollable. Eleanor was thrown hard against the carriage wall as it swerved violently, her shoulders striking the wooden frame with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. Margaret cried out, gripping the seat desperately as the carriage tilted dangerously, before finally, mercifully, the driver managed to bring the horses under control, the vehicle rocking to an unsteady halt at the roadside. "My lady," Margaret's voice was frantic as she reached for Eleanor, who remained slumped against the carriage wall, dazed and struggling to catch her breath. "Are you injured?" I believe so," Eleanor managed, pain radiating sharply through her shoulder and down her arm. She attempted to sit upright and gasped as fresh pain shot through her, sharp enough to bring tears to her eyes. The driver, shaken but uninjured, helped guide the carriage the remaining distance back to the estate at a careful pace, while Margaret held Eleanor steady, murmuring reassurances despite her own visible distress. By the time they arrived at the estate house, word had already reached Julian, who met them at the entrance with an expression of controlled alarm, his usual composure cracking visibly at the sight of his wife's pale, pained face. "What happened?" he demanded, helping her carefully down from the carriage, his hands gentle, despite the urgency in his voice. "A startled horse," the driver explained quickly. "The carriage swerved badly, Your Grace. The Duchess struck the wall rather hard." Julian's jaw tightened as he guided Eleanor inside, calling immediately for Beatrice to send for the estate physician, Dr. Bennett, who lived close enough to arrive within the hour. "I am certain it is nothing serious," Eleanor said, though the pain in her shoulder suggested otherwise, sharp and insistent with every small movement. "We will let the physician determine that," Julian said firmly, guiding her upstairs toward her chambers with careful, steady hands. Panic began building rapidly beneath Eleanor's physical pain, as the reality of the situation settled over her. A physician would need to examine her shoulder properly, which meant removing her gown, which meant the scars she had concealed so carefully for 6 years, would finally, inevitably, come into full view. "Margaret," she whispered urgently, once they reached her chambers, and Julian had stepped briefly into the corridor to speak with Beatrice. "The physician cannot examine me properly. You must find some reason to delay, or handle the examination yourself." "My lady," Margaret said gently, helping her settle onto the bed despite Eleanor's evident distress. "Your shoulder may be seriously injured. I am no physician. If something is broken or displaced, I cannot properly assess that, and neither can you, in the state you are in. Then find some way to keep the room dim. Keep him from examining too closely," Eleanor pleaded, pain and fear mingling desperately in her voice. "Please, Margaret." Margaret hesitated, clearly torn between her loyalty to Eleanor's secret and genuine concern for her well-being. "I will do what I can," she said finally, though her expression remained troubled. "But my lady, if the injury is severe, delaying proper treatment could cause you lasting harm. Some risks are not worth the price of concealment." Before Eleanor could respond further, a knock sounded at the door, and Dr. Bennett entered, a composed older gentleman with kind eyes and steady, experienced hands. Julian followed close behind him, his expression tight with concern. "Let us have a look, Your Grace," Dr. Bennett said gently, approaching the bed. "I understand you struck your shoulder rather forcefully." "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice tight with a mixture of physical pain and rising panic. "Though I am certain it requires nothing more than rest. We shall see." Dr. Bennett's tone remained kind, but firm, clearly a man accustomed to patients minimizing their own injuries. "I will need to examine the shoulder directly, my lady. I understand this may feel uncomfortable, but a proper assessment requires it." Eleanor's eyes darted toward Margaret, silent desperation passing between them, though Margaret could offer nothing beyond a helpless, sympathetic glance in return. "Perhaps," Julian said, noticing her evident distress and misreading it as simple modesty, "I should step outside while the doctor conducts his examination." "No," Eleanor said quickly, then immediately regretted the sharpness of her response, as both men looked at her with visible surprise. She softened her tone, though panic still raced beneath the surface. "That is, I would prefer you remain, if you do not mind. I find comfort in your presence." It was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable, though, even as she spoke the words, she recognized the flaw in her own logic. Julian's presence would not prevent the examination. It would only mean he witnessed the revelation directly, rather than learning of it secondhand through servants' whispers. Dr. Bennett, sensing the tension in the room but unable to fully interpret its source, proceeded carefully. "I will need to loosen the gown at the shoulder, my lady, to properly assess the injury. Margaret, if you would assist." Eleanor's heart pounded violently as Margaret moved forward, hands trembling slightly despite her attempt at composure, and began carefully unfastening the buttons along the back of Eleanor's traveling gown. "Perhaps we might dim the lamps further," Eleanor said, her voice strained. "The light seems rather harsh." Dr. Bennett glanced at her with mild confusion, but nodded to a nearby servant, who adjusted the lamps accordingly, casting the room into softer, dimmer light. It offered little true protection, Eleanor knew, not against a physician's careful, professional eye examining an injury directly. As Margaret loosened the gown and carefully drew back the fabric across her shoulder, Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing herself for the reaction she had spent 6 years dreading. She felt the cool air touch her exposed skin, felt Margaret's hands pause slightly as she guided the fabric away from the discolored, uneven texture that marked her shoulder and upper back. Silence fell over the room. Dr. Bennett's professional composure held steady, though Eleanor heard the faint, almost imperceptible shift in his breathing as his eyes took in the full extent of the scarring, alongside the fresh, darkening bruise from the accident. He said nothing immediately about the older scars, focusing instead on his professional assessment. "There is significant bruising," he said carefully, his fingers gently probing the injured area with practiced care, "though I do not believe the bone is broken. A sprain, most likely, and considerable bruising that will take some weeks to fully heal. Rest, and a supportive wrap should be sufficient." Eleanor barely absorbed his medical assessment, her attention entirely consumed by the sound of Julian's breathing beside her, the sudden stillness in his posture, as his eyes, too, took in the truth she had concealed from him since their very first night together. She did not dare look at him directly, fear keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the far wall, bracing herself for whatever reaction might follow. Pity, discomfort, the quiet withdrawal she had witnessed on other faces in years past when the scars had been glimpsed by accident. But Julian said nothing. Not immediately. The silence stretched long enough that even Dr. Bennett glanced between them, sensing something significant passing unspoken in the room, though he tactfully returned his attention to preparing a supportive wrap for Eleanor's shoulder. As the doctor worked, carefully binding the injured area, Eleanor finally, cautiously, allowed her gaze to shift toward Julian, bracing herself fully for whatever expression she might find waiting there. What she saw instead was not pity, nor discomfort, nor the quiet withdrawal she had feared for 6 long years. It was something far gentler and far more devastating in its own quiet way, understanding, mixed with a depth of tenderness that stole the breath from her lungs more completely than the carriage accident itself had managed. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the reaction she had dreaded. She could not yet find words to answer him, her chest tight with 6 years of carefully guarded fear, finally, unexpectedly, meeting the light. Dr. Bennett finished securing the supportive wrap around Eleanor's shoulder with careful, practiced hands, entirely unaware of the significance of the moment unfolding around him. "You must rest the arm as much as possible for the next several days," he instructed, addressing both Eleanor and Julian in turn. "No lifting, no strain. I will return in a week to check its progress." "Thank you, doctor," Julian said, his voice steady, though his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor, with an intensity she had never seen from him before. "Beatrice will see you out." Once Dr. Bennett had gathered his instruments and departed, along with a visibly anxious Margaret, who lingered only long enough to ensure Eleanor was comfortable before excusing herself to give them privacy. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Eleanor remained seated on the edge of the bed, her gown still loosened at the shoulder, the old scars fully visible in the soft lamplight for the first time to anyone outside her immediate family and Margaret. She felt impossibly exposed, not merely physically, but in every way that mattered. 6 years of careful concealment finally, irreversibly undone. "Say something," she whispered finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, though dread coiled tightly in her stomach at whatever words might follow. Julian moved closer, settling carefully onto the edge of the bed beside her, his movements deliberate and gentle. "How long have you carried this?" he asked softly, his voice free of the pity or discomfort she had braced herself against. 6 years, she said quietly, her eyes finally meeting his directly. "Since I was 17. There was a fire in my childhood home. A candle fell against the drapes in my bedroom while I slept. I escaped, but not entirely unharmed. And you have hidden this ever since?" His tone carried no judgment, only quiet curiosity and something that felt remarkably like compassion. "I did not want anyone to see me differently," Eleanor admitted, the words spilling forth now that the truth had finally emerged, as though a dam long straining against pressure had finally given way. "I watched people's expressions change whenever the scars were glimpsed by accident over the years. Pity, discomfort, sometimes even a kind of quiet fear, as though tragedy itself might prove contagious. I could not bear the thought of you looking at me that way, especially not you." "Why especially me?" Eleanor hesitated, though the moment demanded honesty now more than ever. "Because I had begun to care for you, Julian. More than I expected to, given how this marriage began. I did not want that to change because of something I could not control. Something that happened to me, rather than something I chose." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady and searching. Then, slowly, he reached out and gently, carefully, touched the edge of the scarred skin along her shoulder, his fingers light and reverent rather than hesitant or repelled. Eleanor's breath caught at the contact, surprise and something warmer flooding through her chest. "I do not see something to pity, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I see proof that you survived something terrible, and that you have carried the weight of it alone for far too long. That is not something that should have kept you hidden from me. If anything, it makes me understand you more fully than I did before." Tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes, 6 years of carefully guarded fear finally beginning to loosen their grip on her chest. "You are not troubled by it. By how it looks." "I am troubled," he said honestly, "that you believed you needed to hide this from me, that you carried such fear alone, when you might have trusted me sooner. But the scars themselves, they change nothing about who you are to me, Eleanor. Nothing at all." "Helena left you," Eleanor said softly, the comparison rising unbidden, "because of scars far less extensive than mine. How can you be certain you feel differently now?" Julian's expression grew thoughtful, considering the question with the same careful honesty he had shown throughout their conversation. "Helena left, I believe now. Not truly because of the scars themselves, but because she could not accept that I had changed, that the experience had marked me in ways beyond the physical. She wanted the man I had been before the fire, and could not make peace with who I had become afterward. That is different, Eleanor, from what I feel toward you." "How is it different?" "Because I never knew you before your scars existed," he said simply. "I have only ever known the woman you are now, scars included. There is no earlier version of you I am comparing this to. No sense of loss for someone who no longer exists. You are simply, entirely, the woman I married, the woman I have grown, these past weeks, to genuinely care for." The words settled over Eleanor, like warm sunlight, breaking through clouds that had lingered far too long, and she found herself unable to hold back the tears that had gathered, spilling freely now down her cheeks. "I am sorry," she said, though she could not fully articulate what exactly she was apologizing for. The years of concealment, the sharp words to Grace over the spilled water, the careful distance she had maintained, even as trust grew slowly between them. "You have nothing to apologize for," Julian said gently, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek with careful fingers. "Fear does not require apology, Eleanor, only understanding, which I hope I have shown you tonight." "You have," she whispered. "More than I ever expected." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while afterward, Julian's hand resting gently over hers, neither of them rushing to fill the quiet with further words. Eventually, Eleanor spoke again, her voice steadier now than it had been throughout the entire ordeal. "There is more I should tell you," she said, "about that night, about my family, about everything that led to where we are now." "I would like to hear it," Julian said, "whenever you feel ready to share it." And so, slowly, carefully, Eleanor began to speak, recounting the details of the fire that had changed everything. The terror of waking to flames already spreading across her bedroom, the desperate escape guided by her old nurse's quick thinking, the long months of recovery that followed, filled with pain both physical and otherwise, as she learned to live within a body, forever marked by that single terrible night. Julian listened without interruption, his expression attentive and compassionate throughout, occasionally asking gentle questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere polite curiosity. By the time she finished, the heaviest parts of her story finally spoken aloud after 6 years of careful silence, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in longer than she could remember, as though a burden she had not fully realized the weight of had finally, gradually, begun to lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," Julian said quietly, once she had finished, "for trusting me with this. I know it was not easy." "It was not," she agreed, "but I am glad it is done now. Glad you know, finally, the truth of who I am." "You were always the truth of who you are," he said gently. "The scars simply added detail to a story I am only now beginning to fully understand." Outside the window, the autumn evening had settled fully into darkness, stars beginning to emerge faintly against the deepening sky, and within the quiet chambers of the Ashcombe estate, something significant had shifted between two people who had begun their marriage as careful strangers, and now, slowly, were becoming something far more genuine in return. The days following the accident brought a change to the household that even the servants noticed, though few understood its full cause. Eleanor moved through the estate with a lightness in her step that had not been present before, her shoulders no longer carrying the tense, guarded posture she had maintained since her very first night as Duchess. Her physical injury required careful attention throughout the following week, and Julian insisted on personally checking in on her recovery each morning and evening, a habit that surprised the household staff given his usual reserved nature. Beatrice remarked quietly to Margaret one afternoon that she had never seen the Duke quite so attentive toward anyone, not since his brother's illness years before. "He cares for her deeply," Margaret replied simply, though a small knowing smile touched her lips as she said it. One evening, nearly a week after the carriage accident, Julian asked Eleanor to join him in his private study after dinner, a request that carried an unusual formality in his tone. Eleanor arrived to find him standing near the window, his expression thoughtful, a small wooden box resting on the desk beside him. "I wanted to speak with you properly," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "about what has passed between us this week, and what I hope might follow." Eleanor settled into the chair across from his desk, curiosity and a quiet nervousness mingling in her chest. "Of course." Julian remained standing for a moment longer, gathering his thoughts carefully, before finally speaking. "When we married, Eleanor, I will admit, I did not expect to find genuine connection so quickly, if at all. Ours was, in many ways, a practical arrangement, beneficial to both our families. I respected that arrangement, and I intended to honor it fully, whatever affection might or might not develop between us over time." "I understood the same," Eleanor said quietly. "But these past weeks have shown me something I did not anticipate," Julian continued, moving to sit in the chair beside her rather than across the desk, closing the distance between them deliberately. "I have come to care for you, Eleanor, far beyond simple respect or practical partnership. And what happened this week, learning the truth you carried so carefully, only deepened that feeling, rather than diminishing it." Eleanor's heart quickened, though she remained quiet, allowing him to continue. "I want to make you a promise," he said, reaching for her hand and holding it gently within both of his own. "Not the formal vows we spoke at our wedding, though those remain true as well, something more personal, between the two of us alone." "I am listening," Eleanor said softly. "I promise you," Julian said, his voice steady and sincere, "that you will never again need to hide any part of yourself from me. Not your scars, not your fears, not whatever else you may carry that feels too difficult to share. Whatever you bring to this marriage, I will meet it with patience and understanding, exactly as I hope you would extend the same to me in return." Tears gathered once more in Eleanor's eyes, though these carried none of the pain or fear of previous days, only overwhelming relief and gratitude. "That is a significant promise," she whispered. "I intend to keep it," Julian said firmly, "for as long as we both shall live." This marriage began as an arrangement between families, Eleanor, but I no longer wish it to remain merely that. I want it to become something built on complete honesty between us, whatever difficulties that honesty might occasionally bring. "I want that as well," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than I realized I wanted it, until this past week showed me what such honesty could feel like." Julian reached for the small wooden box resting on his desk, opening it carefully to reveal a delicate pendant inside, a small pressed flower, preserved beneath clear glass, set within a simple silver frame. "This belonged to my mother," he explained, lifting it gently. "She wore it throughout her marriage to my father, and told me once that it represented a promise between them, that whatever storms life brought, they would face them honestly, together, rather than separately and in silence. I would like you to have it, if you are willing to accept both the pendant and the promise it represents." Eleanor's breath caught as she studied the delicate piece, understanding the weight of what he offered extended far beyond the physical object itself. "I accept," she said softly, "both the pendant and everything it represents." Julian carefully fastened the pendant around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin, and when he finished, he did not immediately step back, instead remaining close, his gaze steady on hers. "May I ask you something else?" he said quietly. "Of course. Would you be willing, now that the truth has come between us honestly, to no longer feel the need for dim candlelight, or careful angles, or high collars regardless of season? Not because I require it of you, but because I hope you might feel free enough, finally, to simply exist without such careful guarding." Eleanor considered the question, feeling something shift within her chest, a loosening of tension she had carried for so long it had become nearly invisible to her, simply a permanent state of being, rather than a choice she consciously made each day. "I would like to try," she said finally. "It may take time. Old habits are not easily undone, but I would like to try, especially with you." "That is all I ask," Julian said gently. "Time and the willingness to try. Nothing more." They sat together for a while longer that evening, conversation flowing more freely than it ever had before, the careful walls that had defined their early marriage finally beginning to dissolve into something warmer, more genuine, built now on a foundation of honesty rather than careful performance. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, Margaret noticed the pendant resting against her collarbone and smiled warmly, understanding immediately its significance without needing explanation. "He made you a promise," Margaret said softly, helping remove the pins from Eleanor's hair. "He did," Eleanor confirmed, touching the small pendant thoughtfully. "And I believe, Margaret, that for the first time since the fire, I truly believe such a promise can be kept." That night, when Margaret prepared to dim the lamps as usual before leaving the room, Eleanor stopped her gently. "Leave them as they are," she said quietly. "Just this once, I would like to try." Margaret studied her for a long moment before nodding, understanding the significance of the small request, and left the lamps burning steadily as she departed for the evening, leaving Eleanor alone in a room bathed in warm, honest light, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The weeks that followed brought a transformation to the Ashcombe household that seemed to touch every corner of the estate. Eleanor found herself, gradually, wearing gowns with slightly lower necklines, sleeves that ended just above rather than fully covering her wrists, small changes that would have seemed insignificant to anyone unaware of the years of careful concealment behind them. Julian noticed each small shift, though he never commented directly, simply offering quiet, encouraging smiles whenever she made such choices, careful never to push her further than she felt ready to go. One afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens his brother had once tended so carefully, Eleanor found herself sharing more details of her recovery after the fire. The physicians who had treated her, the months spent unable to move her arm properly, the quiet despair she had felt as a 17-year-old girl convinced her life had somehow ended, even as her body continued living. I believed, for a long while, she admitted, that no one would ever look at me again without seeing only the scars, rather than the person beneath them. I understand that fear, Julian said quietly, though I am glad to say I believe you were wrong. I am beginning to believe that myself, Eleanor said, a genuine smile touching her lips. Their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed by the wider household, nor by county society, which had begun to whisper, in far kinder tones than Priscilla's earlier insinuations, about the surprising warmth developing between the Duke and his new Duchess. Lady Priscilla, however, had not abandoned her earlier curiosity, and word eventually reached the estate that she had been making pointed inquiries among the servants of neighboring households, attempting to piece together whatever secret she believed Eleanor to be hiding. Beatrice brought this information to Julian directly one morning, her expression carefully neutral, though clearly troubled by the implications. She has been asking rather direct questions, Your Grace, about the Duchess's habits, her past, anything unusual the staff might have noticed. Julian's jaw tightened at the news, protective instinct flaring sharply. Has she learned anything specific? Nothing confirmed, as far as I am aware, Beatrice said, though her persistence suggests she suspects something significant, and does not intend to abandon the pursuit easily. That evening, Julian shared the news with Eleanor, watching carefully for her reaction. To his surprise, rather than the fear he expected, Eleanor's expression remained calm, thoughtful. Let her ask, Eleanor said finally. Let her search for whatever secret she believes she will find. I no longer intend to hide the truth as though it were something shameful, Julian. If she wishes to spread whispers about scars I earned surviving a fire that nearly took my life, she will find that such whispers carry far less power over me now than they once might have. Julian studied her with evident pride and admiration. You have grown remarkably brave these past weeks. I have had good reason to, Eleanor said softly, reaching for his hand, and good support, in finding that courage. The opportunity to address Priscilla's persistent curiosity directly arrived sooner than expected, at a small gathering hosted by a neighboring family shortly afterward. Eleanor attended wearing a gown with a modestly lowered neckline, deliberately choosing not to conceal the edge of scarring visible along her collarbone, a small but significant act of quiet defiance against years of careful hiding. Priscilla noticed immediately, her sharp eyes catching the visible marks before quickly schooling her expression back into practiced neutrality. She approached Eleanor later in the evening, her curiosity clearly overwhelming her usual caution. Duchess, she said, her tone carrying less its usual mockery, and more genuine, if unwelcome, curiosity. I could not help but notice. That is, I wondered. You wondered about my scars, Eleanor finished calmly, meeting her gaze directly, without flinching. Yes, Lady Priscilla. I carry scars from a fire that nearly killed me when I was 17 years old. I concealed them for 6 years, out of fear of exactly the kind of reaction you seem intent on provoking. I no longer intend to carry that fear. Priscilla's composure faltered visibly, clearly caught off guard by the direct, unashamed acknowledgement. I meant no offense, Duchess. I was simply curious. Then your curiosity is satisfied, Eleanor said, her tone polite but firm. I survived something terrible, Lady Priscilla, and I carry the marks of that survival. I do not intend to apologize for it, nor to hide it any longer, for the comfort of those who might find it uncomfortable to witness. Something shifted in Priscilla's expression, surprise giving way slowly to something that almost resembled respect, however reluctant. You speak with remarkable confidence, Duchess. I have earned it, Eleanor replied simply, before excusing herself to rejoin Julian, who had watched the exchange from across the room, with quiet pride evident in his expression. You handled that beautifully, he murmured, once she returned to his side. I had excellent motivation, Eleanor said, smiling genuinely, for the first time in Priscilla's presence since their very first meeting. Word of the exchange spread quickly through county society in the days that followed, and rather than the scandal Priscilla had perhaps hoped to provoke, the story instead earned Eleanor a quiet admiration among the neighboring families, several of whom sought her out directly at subsequent gatherings. curious about the woman who had faced potential humiliation with such calm, unshaken dignity. Priscilla herself grew notably quieter in her interactions with Eleanor afterward, her sharp comments softening gradually into something closer to grudging respect, though genuine warmth between them remained distant and unlikely. At home, meanwhile, the bond between Eleanor and Julian continued deepening steadily, built now on a foundation far sturdier than the careful, practiced courtesy that had defined their early marriage. They spoke openly of difficult subjects that once would have remained carefully avoided, shared vulnerabilities that drew them closer rather than creating distance, and found, increasingly, genuine joy in each other's company, beyond simple dutiful partnership. One evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, Julian reading quietly, while Eleanor worked on a small embroidery project nearby, she paused suddenly, studying him with quiet affection. "What troubles you?" he asked, noticing her attention. "Nothing troubles me," she said softly. "I was simply thinking how different this feels from where we began. I did not expect, on our wedding day, that I would ever feel this settled, this genuinely happy, within our marriage." Julian set aside his book, reaching for her hand. "Nor did I, if I am entirely honest, but I find myself grateful, every day, that circumstances led us here regardless." "As am I," Eleanor said, leaning into his embrace with a comfort that would have seemed impossible only months before. Outside, autumn had begun giving way to the first cold breath of winter, though within the walls of the Ashcombe estate, warmth had settled more fully and genuinely than it ever had before, built now on truth rather than careful concealment, on trust rather than fear, on a promise made and faithfully kept between two people who had each, in their own way, learned that scars need not remain hidden forever to be truly healed. Winter settled fully over the Ashcombe estate by the time the annual county assembly arrived, a grand tradition hosted each year by the leading families of the region, drawing guests from across the countryside for an evening widely considered the most significant social event of the season. Eleanor had attended smaller gatherings, with growing confidence over recent weeks, but the assembly represented something far larger, a room filled with hundreds of guests, bright chandeliers, and the kind of intense social scrutiny that had once terrified her beyond measure. "You seem nervous," Julian observed, as they prepared for the evening, Margaret putting the finishing touches on Eleanor's gown, a deep sapphire silk that Eleanor had chosen deliberately, its neckline modest but no longer excessively high, its sleeves ending gracefully at her wrists rather than covering them entirely. "It is a great deal of attention, all at once," Eleanor admitted, studying her reflection in the mirror, "though I find I am nervous for different reasons than I once might have been." "And what reasons are those?" "I am no longer nervous about being seen," she said thoughtfully. "I am simply nervous the way anyone might be, entering a room full of strangers and acquaintances alike, that feels remarkably different from the fear I once carried." Julian smiled warmly, crossing the room to stand beside her. "That is progress worth celebrating, I think." The pendant his mother had once worn rested against her collarbone, as it had every day since he had given it to her, a quiet reminder of the promise they had made to each other, and Eleanor touched it briefly before turning to face him fully. "Shall we?" she said, extending her hand. The assembly hall glittered with candlelight and polished silver when they arrived. Hundreds of guests already gathered in animated conversation, the air filled with music and laughter. Eleanor felt the familiar flutter of nerves as they entered, though she kept her chin lifted, her posture steady, drawing on the confidence she had built gradually over recent months. They were greeted warmly by their hosts, and soon found themselves swept into the familiar rhythm of introductions, polite conversation, and the occasional dance. Eleanor noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that the curious glances directed her way carried far less of the sharp scrutiny she had once dreaded, and far more simple, ordinary interest in the new Duchess who had, over recent months, become something of a quietly admired figure throughout the county. Several ladies approached her directly during the evening, engaging her in genuine conversation, rather than the careful, probing questions Priscilla had once favored. One older woman, the wife of a prominent local landowner, spoke with particular warmth. "I heard of your encounter with Lady Priscilla some weeks ago," the woman said, her tone kind rather than gossiping. "I must say, Duchess, I admired greatly the composure you showed. It is not every woman who could face such pointed curiosity with such quiet dignity. "Thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by the sentiment. "It was not always easy to find that dignity, I confess, but I had good reason to seek it." "Your husband, I imagine," the woman said, glancing toward Julian, who stood nearby in conversation with several other gentlemen, though his attention clearly remained partially on Eleanor, even from a distance. "Among other reasons," Eleanor said, smiling. As the evening progressed, Julian found moments to steal Eleanor away for quiet conversation between the more formal social obligations, their connection evident enough that even casual observers began to comment on the genuine warmth between the Duke and his Duchess, a marked contrast to the purely practical arrangement many had expected from their union. Near midnight, as the assembly began winding toward its natural conclusion, Julian led Eleanor onto the dance floor for what would be their final dance of the evening, the orchestra playing a slow, graceful waltz that allowed for quiet conversation between the careful steps. "You have handled tonight beautifully," Julian murmured, guiding her smoothly across the floor. "I had the best possible partner beside me," Eleanor replied, meeting his eyes with open affection that would have felt impossible to display so publicly, only months before. "I meant to ask," Julian said, his tone growing slightly more serious, "whether you might consider something, now that the season is drawing toward its close." "What did you have in mind?" "My brother's birthday falls in early spring," Julian said carefully. "Our family has traditionally held a small remembrance gathering in the gardens he loved so dearly. I had considered, this year, perhaps expanding it slightly, inviting a few more guests, sharing his memory more openly than we have in recent years." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully, understanding the significance of what he proposed. "You wish to open something private to wider eyes." "I suppose I do," Julian admitted, "watching you find courage to share your own difficult truths. I find myself wanting to do the same, regarding my brother's memory. I have kept his passing rather private for years, out of my own grief. Perhaps it is time to honor him more openly instead." "I think that sounds beautiful," Eleanor said softly, "and I would be honored to help you plan it, if you would like." "I would like that very much," Julian said, his expression warm with gratitude. They finished their dance in comfortable silence, the music swelling gently around them, and as the final notes faded, Julian drew her slightly closer, his voice low enough for her ears alone. "I am grateful, every single day, that circumstances brought us together, Eleanor. Whatever fears either of us carried when we began this marriage, I believe we have built something far stronger than either of us could have managed alone."
"As do I,"
Eleanor whispered, resting her head briefly against his shoulder as the dance concluded.
"indifferent now to whatever curious eyes might observe the tender moment."
The carriage ride home that night passed in comfortable quiet, both of them pleasantly weary from the evening's festivities, though contentment settled warmly over them both, rather than the anxious tension that had once accompanied every social gathering. "Thank you," Eleanor said eventually, breaking the peaceful silence, "for tonight, and for every day since the accident that brought everything into the light. I do not believe I could have found this courage without your patience guiding me toward it." "You found the courage yourself, Eleanor," Julian said gently, reaching for her hand in the darkness of the carriage. "I simply offered patience, and the promise that you would never need to hide from me. The rest, the courage, the growth, the confidence you have built these past months, all of that belongs entirely to you." As the carriage rolled steadily through the quiet winter countryside, carrying them home, toward the estate that had become, gradually and genuinely, a true home, rather than merely a practical arrangement, Eleanor allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to believe that whatever challenges the future might bring, she would face them no longer alone, no longer hidden, but openly, honestly, and together with the man who had kept his promise faithfully, exactly as he had sworn he would. Spring arrived early at the Ashcombe estate that year, the gardens bursting into color weeks ahead of schedule, as though nature itself wished to celebrate the transformation that had taken root within the household over the preceding months. Preparations for the remembrance gathering, honoring Julian's late brother, occupied much of Eleanor's attention throughout early spring, and she threw herself into the planning with genuine enthusiasm, determined to create something that would properly honor his memory, while offering Julian the open, healing tribute he had described wanting. The gardens themselves required careful attention, and Eleanor spent many mornings working alongside the estate's gardener, ensuring the roses Julian's brother had planted years before would bloom in full glory for the occasion. She found unexpected peace in the quiet work, her hands in the soil, the morning sun warm against skin she no longer felt compelled to shield from view. Margaret, watching one such morning from the garden path, remarked with quiet satisfaction on how far Eleanor had come since those anxious early days of the marriage. "You seem truly at peace, my lady," Margaret observed, settling onto a nearby bench. "I am," Eleanor said, straightening from her work among the rose bushes, brushing dirt from her hands. "More than I ever believed possible, when this all began." The day of the remembrance gathering arrived beneath a clear, bright spring sky, the gardens in full bloom, tables arranged thoughtfully throughout the grounds, where guests could gather to share memories and quiet conversation. Julian had invited a modest but meaningful gathering, close family, longtime household staff who had known his brother personally, and a handful of trusted friends from the wider county. Eleanor stood beside Julian as guests began arriving, watching him greet each one with a warmth and openness she had not witnessed from him before. The careful reserve he once maintained around discussions of his brother's memory, now replaced with genuine, if still somewhat tender, willingness to share. "Thank you for helping make this possible," Julian said quietly, as they paused between greeting guests. "I do not believe I could have found the courage to open this day so widely without your example guiding me." "You found the courage yourself," Eleanor said, echoing his own words back to him with a gentle smile. "I simply offered encouragement, exactly as you once offered me the same." The gathering unfolded beautifully throughout the afternoon, guests sharing fond memories of Julian's brother, laughter mingling naturally with occasional quiet tears, the atmosphere one of genuine healing rather than solemn obligation. Eleanor watched Julian throughout the day, noting the way tension he had carried for years around the subject of his brother's passing seemed to ease gradually with each shared memory, each warm story exchanged among those who had loved him. Near the gathering's conclusion, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward evening, Julian gathered the guests briefly near the rose garden his brother had so carefully tended, offering a few words of gratitude for their presence and their shared memories. "My brother once told me," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet garden, "that even after the harshest winter, beautiful things could still grow again." I did not fully understand what he meant, not truly, until recent months showed me the truth of it myself. He glanced toward Eleanor as he spoke, and she felt warmth spread through her chest at the unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. "Thank you all," Julian continued, "for joining us today, for helping honor his memory, and for witnessing what I hope will become a new tradition for our family, one built on openness rather than quiet grief carried alone." The gathering concluded with quiet applause and warm embraces, guests slowly departing as evening approached, leaving Eleanor and Julian alone finally among the roses as the sky began deepening toward twilight. "You did something beautiful today," Eleanor said softly, taking his hand as they walked slowly through the garden. "We did," Julian corrected gently. "This healing belongs to both of us, Eleanor, exactly as everything else has. Since that difficult night, the truth finally came between us honestly." They paused near the fountain, where they had first spoken openly of grief and loss, months earlier, and Julian turned to face her fully, his expression warm with an emotion that had grown steadily, genuinely, throughout their unconventional beginning. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how far we have both traveled since our wedding night. Two strangers, each carrying secrets we believed too dangerous to share, building walls we thought necessary for protection. And now?" Eleanor asked softly. "Now I find myself married to a woman of remarkable courage," Julian said, reaching up to gently touch the pendant, still resting faithfully against her collarbone. "A woman who taught me, through her own bravery, that scars, whatever form they take, need not remain hidden to be healed. That honesty, however frightening initially, builds something far stronger than careful concealment ever could." Eleanor's eyes filled with grateful tears, though these carried only joy now, none of the fear that had once accompanied any mention of her past. "And I married a man who kept every promise he made me, even when honesty proved difficult for him as well. Who showed me, through his own patience and vulnerability, that being truly seen need not end in rejection. "I love you," Julian said simply, the words settling naturally between them. An honest declaration, built on months of genuine trust, rather than the careful performance that had once defined their early days together. "Not despite your scars, Eleanor, but as part of the complete, remarkable woman you are." "I love you as well," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and sure, completely, and without reservation. They stood together among the roses, as evening settled fully over the estate, stars beginning to emerge faintly against the darkening sky. Two people who had begun their marriage as careful strangers, bound by practical arrangement, and who now stood together as genuine partners, bound instead by trust, freely given, and faithfully honored. In the months that followed, the Ashcombe estate continued flourishing, both in its gardens and within its walls, the household staff often remarking quietly among themselves on the genuine warmth that had settled permanently over the Duke and Duchess, a warmth entirely absent during those early, careful weeks following their wedding. Eleanor no longer concealed her scars beneath careful angles and dim candlelight, wearing them instead as simply another part of the woman she had become, proof of survival rather than shame, a reminder of how far both she and Julian had traveled together, from fear toward genuine, lasting happiness. And each evening, as she prepared for bed within the chambers that had once felt so fraught with anxious secrecy, Eleanor would touch the small pendant resting against her collarbone, remembering the promise Julian had made her, and the quiet, steady way he had kept it faithfully, day after day, exactly as he had sworn he always would. The scars remained, faint reminders of a night that had once threatened to define her forever, through fear and concealment. But they no longer held power over her happiness, no longer demanded the careful vigilance she had maintained for 6 long, exhausting years. Instead, they had become simply part of her story, one chapter among many, in a life that had ultimately led her toward a love built not on perfection, but on the far sturdier foundation of honesty, patience, and a promise faithfully kept between two people who had each, in their own time, learned that being truly known was never something to fear, but rather the very thing that made a life worth living fully, openly, and together.